Beethoven was forced to stare into the abyss every day. Imagine you're living in a time when there's been tumultuous upheaval, when there's tremendous uncertainty, when every day brings new terrors. There are fresh memories of blood spilled in the streets. Civilization is regressing into constant tribal conflict. You feel as if you have glimpsed the apocalypse. But along with that existential dread, your health is declining and doctors can't help you. Your usual sources of income have dried up. You're having conflicts with your family, and you realize that you're alone. And on top of all that, imagine you're functionally deaf. But your world is not completely silent because you wake up every morning to ringing in your ears, high A's and high E's, which can suddenly erupt into a roar of noise that fills your head like the most violent storm raging inside your brain. And so he depicts his world of terror and uncertainty with sounds that mirror the vacuum of sound in his head, what Pythagoras called the music of the spheres, the basic overtones that surround us in nature. They're playing low notes that make the upper open strings resonate. So here I am playing a low A, but it's making the A string resonate. Hear that? And that's how he gets this shimmering quality from the strings and horns. The movement progresses. We go from one scene of horror to another, and there is one moment that always sounds like chaos that the center cannot hold. But there are moments in this movement when the music reflects how we try to maintain hope in the darkest of times. And we occasionally hear a fragment of what seems like a half-forgotten melody. Hear that in the oboe? Those notes sound familiar. Well, about a half hour from now, in the running time of the entire symphony, the rest of that tune will be remembered. But between now and then, Beethoven conveys a hard-won lesson he's imparting to us all. The only way out is through. 116 beats per minute. While most conductors agree that that's a fine tempo for the main part of the scherzo, when it comes to the trio section, all bets are off. You're hearing this played at the tempo half note equals 116, which is the marking that appeared in the edition of the Ninth Symphony that was published during Beethoven's lifetime. But what that recording didn't take into account was a letter Beethoven sent to the publisher saying that they got it wrong, and that it's really a whole note equals 116, which would be exactly twice as fast, which would sound like this. That performance conforms to the tempo indication that appears in most modern editions. Now, you could say that that is just way too fast and couldn't possibly be what Beethoven intended, but there are actually a couple of other works written at around the same time that have a similar tempo. For example, the Scherzo of the String Quartet, Opus 131. And listen to the bassoon in this passage from the Consecration of the House Overture. So if a bassoon can do that, they can't complain about having to do this. But there are some scholars who think that neither tempo is right, and their theory has to do with the fact that Beethoven actually didn't write these tempo indications in his own hand, but dictated them to his nephew Karl, and that he may have misheard his uncle and wrote down 116 when Beethoven said 160. Now, one obvious problem with this theory is that while in English, 16 does sound a lot like 60, in German, 16 sounds quite different from 60. However, a lot of major conductors take this theory very seriously, even in Germany, because they see 160 as a good compromise tempo between those two extremes. And despite the dubiousness of the misheard dictation theory, that is the tempo most conductors take for that passage. It's astonishing to realize that this symphony is a central work of Western culture for 200 years. And yet, there is still not one universally agreed upon edition of this piece, and scholars are still arguing over details of the score. Beethoven himself was exasperated trying up to his dying day to get publishers to make corrections to his score because he discovered that every time they corrected one error, they made a new one somewhere else. Which means that it's highly likely that scholars and conductors will still be debating these issues in another 200 years. We start with a hymn that turns into a dialogue between the winds, specifically clarinets, bassoons, and horns, and the strings, without double basses, so it has a texture of a string quartet. The whole movement seems to be aspiring to chamber music. It's a public portrayal of intimacy, like a stage whisper. The movement is technically a set of variations, but Beethoven structures it in such a way that we can't follow the structure. We're not meant to admire it, but to become lost in it. It's interesting that at the same time that he was writing the Diabelli variations, one of the greatest examples of the traditional format of a parade of short pieces that are all connected through harmonic structure that we listen to for the clever way it varies the surface content while keeping the architecture of the theme, he was also writing movements like this one, as well as similar movements in his late piano sonatas and string quartets, in which he completely transformed the variation concept into a type of alternative sonata form. He wants to hypnotize us, utilizing a variety of transformational devices to sweep us along on wings of song. This movement sings like few others do, though occasionally the instruments are playing melodies that the human voice could not possibly sing. One of the ways this movement prepares us for the monumental last movement is in its constant shifts. After the first statement of the main theme in 4/4 time, we get this new theme in a different key in 3/4 time. And then we have a variation of the 4/4 section, then a variation of the 3/4 section, then a variation of the 4/4 section but in a different key, and a prominent horn solo, and then finally a section in 12/8 that lasts till the end of the movement but internally contains its own constant shifts in mood and texture. In this way, Beethoven is getting us used to having the ground constantly shift beneath our feet, as it will continue to do throughout the last movement. One of the most jarring and unexpected episodes in the last section is this fanfare with trumpets and timpani. Beethoven has always had a habit of interrupting his idyllic scenes with reminders of the battle and turmoil of the world outside that scene, but this feels different. These do not sound like trumpets of war, but a heavenly summons, preparing us for Schiller's vision of a plane of universal brotherhood beyond the stars. You're listening to the final movement of Beethoven's String Quartet in A minor, Opus 132, which uses a melody that Beethoven originally intended for the last movement of his Ninth Symphony, when he thought it was going to be a purely instrumental movement. But then he got another idea, an idea inspired by a poem written in a house in Dresden nearly 40 years before the premiere of the Ninth Symphony. Christian Gottfried Körner was a legal scholar and judge who was born the same year as Mozart, 1756. By the 1780s, Mozart was one of many prominent artists who frequented Körner's home in Dresden, which he had turned into a literary and musical salon, even going so far as to construct a small theater on his property. Körner provided artists with a place they could experiment and explore ideas without fear of the judgment of critics and censors, and in doing so, he not only helped foster the creativity of great artists, but saved their lives. One of his literary guests was Friedrich Schiller, who was 3 years younger than Kerner. He began his career as an army doctor, but he got himself in trouble by going AWOL from his regiment to attend the performance of one of his plays and having an affair with an army officer's wife. He went on the run, traveling from city to city to keep one step ahead of the authorities and the aggrieved parties until Kerner invited him to live in his house. Schiller took refuge there for 2 years until he was able to resolve his legal and financial problems and secure an academic position. It was while staying with Kerner that he wrote his poem Ode to Joy, inspired by his gratitude to Kerner and admiration for the artistic utopia he created, a tribute to the power of friendship and the values of universal brotherhood. Ode to Joy soon became one of his greatest hits, and it particularly struck a chord with a teenager living in Bonn named Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven continued to refer to the poem in his writings and sketchbooks and made a couple of attempts at setting it until he finally incorporated it into his Ninth Symphony in 1824. Schiller himself died in 1805, having substantially revised his most famous poem 2 years earlier. Beethoven himself drastically edited the text, and it's clear from the choices he made that, as much as he loved the poem, he was using it to make his own statement that was somewhat distinct from Schiller's. The poem, Ode to Joy, was the product of youthful idealism, whereas Beethoven's Ninth was the product of a lifetime's worth of wisdom. Beethoven was deaf and socially isolated, whose relationships to others were almost always transactional, with no romantic relationships or friends he could completely trust, and yet, in the Ninth Symphony, he composed the most powerful testament ever created to the infinite possibilities of the two things that he didn't have access to: sound and community. Perhaps Beethoven is ultimately more like Kerner than like Schiller. In this symphony, he created a place of refuge that everyone can claim for themselves. While the original poem was essentially a drinking song for the rebel forces, Beethoven's Ode to Joy is an anthem that can't be confined to any one country, but is for der ganzen Welt, the whole world. Friends.
Oh, 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 friends, no more of those sounds.
No more of those sounds.
Instead, let us play notes of joy and pleasure.
Joy.
Joy.
Freedom.
Freedom.
Beautiful sparks of creation.
Children of paradise.
Drunk with passion, we worship in your realm.
Your magic unites those divided by cultures.
We all live as sisters and brothers, cradled in your gentle wings.
Your magic unites those divided by cultures.
We all live as sisters and brothers, cradled in your gentle wings.
If ever you have known a loyal friend to whom you have repaid your truest faith,
If ever you have found a loving spouse, come sing with us and share your jubilation.
Yes, all who with one soul have forged a bond that no impediment can break, come sing.
Those who will not share their lives with others must turn away while weeping lonely tears.
Yes, all who with one soul have forged a bond that no impediment can break, come sing.
Those who will not share their lives with others must turn away while weeping lonely tears.
By nature, we are nourished in freedom and in joy.
She casts no judgment on those who walk the path among her roses.
She kisses us and serves us wine, always a friend, even in death.
For even the worm is driven by the spark of creation, and even the child stands before God.
For even the worm is driven by the spark of creation.
And even the child stands before God.
With the same glee that swiftly propels the stars across the heavens, so should we happily sprint through life triumphant.
Joy, freedom, beautiful sparks of creation, children of paradise.
Feel the embrace, ye multitudes. This kiss is for the whole world.
We are children of loving parents who dwell beyond the stars.
Do you kneel before them, multitudes? Do you know from whence you came? Look for them above the stars. They must dwell beyond the stars.
They must dwell beyond the
They must
stars.
dwell beyond
They
the
must
stars.
dwell beyond the stars.
They must dwell beyond the
They
stars.
must dwell beyond the stars.
Joy, freedom. Beautiful sparks of creation, children of paradise, sparks of creation. Beethoven figured out something while suffering in his deafness and isolation. He complained his whole life about how alone he was, but in this symphony he taps into a truth that he had the perspective to truly understand. Everyone feels alone. One can feel more alone being with someone who doesn't understand you or doesn't try to, than to simply be by yourself. In fact, the more one is isolated, the more terrified one is of what is on the other side of the door. And many of us spend isolation on trial as we judge our own actions, past and present. What is extraordinary about the truth Beethoven taps into is that, while it presents a vision of a world community, which is presented literally with the sight of over 100 performers on stage, the actual experience we all have of this work is a solitary one. Sure, in a live performance you can feel the collective energy of the audience around you, but everyone is going to process this music a little bit differently, and the more closely you listen to the music, the more detached you will be from your fellow listeners or even the spectacle of the performers on stage. Even in the midst of a full auditorium, you can experience a direct communion with Beethoven himself. This symphony distills the human experience down to 1 hour. Everyone has stared into the abyss of the first movement. Everyone has powered through their pain into the rush of bustling activity of the second movement. Everyone has felt the temporary rewards of the trio, perhaps by visiting nature, or that one fleeting moment of pleasure. Everyone has had a yearning for the vision promised by the third movement. Everyone has had moments on the brink where you have to make impossible choices about which path to take. The path the cellos and basses take is to go somewhere new, instead of the familiar roads of conflict, immersing oneself in activities, getting lost in dreams. We have the option of a new path where we dare to choose joy. And when we hear the chorus sing "All men are brothers," we realize that it's not about some giant party that we're missing out on. It means that the party is inside of us. From his first symphony to his last, Beethoven has shown us different visions of home. In each one, the ending is both unexpected and inevitable. We didn't know where we were going when we started out, but by the time we got there, we somehow recognized it and knew it was the right place. For 2 centuries, we have turned to this work to remind ourselves what it is we really want from civilization, from art, from ourselves. It has outlasted any political use to which it has been put, but its hour-long journey from terrifying depths to euphoric heights is something that speaks to all of us as we all struggle and strive towards joy.